A boy no older than 12 stands at the edge of a banquet hall that glitters like a jewel box. Golden cups catch the flicker of oil lamps, their polished rims reflecting the dancing flames. Platters overflow with roasted meats, dripping fat onto silver trays. The air is thick with perfume, jasmine, myrrh, crushed rose petals, meant to disguise the stench of sweat and wine. He is barefoot. His ankles bleed where iron shackles bite into tender skin. Each movement sends a ripple of pain up his thin legs, yet he dares not collapse. The nobles lounge on silk cushions, their laughter sharp, cruel, echoing like steel against stone. One gestures, and the boy is forced forward. Knees hit marble. Floor is cold, unyielding. He trembles as goblets are raised, as eyes fix on him, not with pity, but with amusement. The hall roars with delight at his humiliation. For the rich, this was not cruelty. This was entertainment. And yet, if you asked the world beyond those palace walls who these men and women were, they would not speak of chains and humiliation. They would speak of glory. The aristocrats were the shimmering crown of their civilization. Draped in robes dyed with rare silks, their garments glowed like the wings of exotic birds. They were praised as the keepers of beauty, patrons of poetry, guardians of temples that soared skyward in marble and gold. Festivals in their honor filled the streets with music, dancers painted in vibrant pigments, incense curling above the crowds like prayers made visible. To the common eye, they were godlike figures, refined, wise, chosen by destiny. Their names were etched on temple walls, carved into triumphal arches, written into hymns that spoke of generosity and divine favor. When they walked among their subjects, people lowered their heads, believing they stood in the presence of something greater than human. But greatness has two faces, because behind the polished facades, the reality was darker than night. While marble glistened in sunlight, beneath the same palaces were dungeons where cries were smothered by stone walls. While poets wrote verses of love and virtue, victims knelt in silence as their innocence was stripped away. And while the world admired the aristocrats' elegance, those closest to them knew that refinement was a mask hiding rot. It was a dual reality, the surface, radiant and untouchable, the underside dripping with blood and shame. What glittered above ground was only possible because of what suffered below it. Every jeweled crown was paid for with human degradation. Every temple stone was lifted by enslaved hands. Every banquet overflowed only because someone else starved. And yet, history books, written by victors and beneficiaries, told only of the light. They described the pageantry, the rituals, the splendor. They left out the stench, the bruises, the broken bodies. The horror was known, whispered in corridors, inscribed in secret letters, sometimes scratched into the walls of cells by those who would never see daylight again. But those voices were silenced, suppressed, erased. What survived was a portrait of glory, cleansed of cruelty, a history written to praise aristocrats as the pinnacle of human civilization. But beneath every polished word lies what they hoped you'd never see and what you're about to discover is the truth they buried, because the soil has its own memory, and when the ground is cut open, it tells a story the aristocrats could not erase. Archaeologists, peeling back the layers of marble and earth, have found things that history books never dared to print. Beneath the banquet halls, the very rooms where nobles drank from goblets of gold, child-sized skeletons were uncovered, curled as if still trying to protect themselves. Some bore cut marks on their bones, clean slices from blades that left no doubt. These were not accidents of burial. These were wounds inflicted in life. Further beneath, shards of inscription whisper phrases the polished histories left out, lines etched into stone, fragmentary but chilling, feasts of shame, offerings of flesh. The words echo not devotion, but degradation, not prayers, but records of humiliation disguised as ritual. And then the papyrus, fragile, blackened with age, salvaged from the sands. Not the poetry sung in festivals, but private accounts, copied by trembling scribes. They describe games where slaves were forced to run until collapse, beaten for the laughter of watching nobles. Others detail punishments so cruel they read like fiction, eyes blinded with hot irons, tongues cut to silence pleas. These were not tales of myth. They were inventory, methodical, recorded, undeniable. The forensic evidence is even harder to dismiss. Excavation layers reveal patches of burned hair fused into soil, traces of blood absorbed into porous stone, shackles still rusted into the walls where dungeons once stood. Scientific analysis confirms it. This was no myth, no exaggeration. It was systematic, and yet most of these discoveries are hidden. In museum archives, bones are locked away in drawers marked unclassified. Papyrus fragments are translated only in private circles, their texts edited before reaching the public. Descriptions of torture chambers are softened into the neutral language of ceremonial rooms. What the evidence screams, the institutions whisper, because to tell the truth would shatter the image of civilization we still cling to. To admit that the aristocrats celebrated celebrated as paragons of refinement, built their elegance on cruelty, would mean accepting that beauty itself was fed by horror, and so the forbidden truths remain buried. Not in the ground this time, but in silence. But silence cannot hold forever. What you're about to see is how cruelty wasn't chaos. It was system. It was structure. It was by design, because the horror was not random. It was not the passing cruelty of a drunken noble, or the isolated madness of a tyrant. No, this was a system. A machine of suffering, built with precision, maintained with discipline, perfected over generations. At the very top stood the aristocrats themselves. Their word was command, their appetite the law. A gesture of the hand, a murmur of desire, and an entire machinery of human degradation was set in motion. But they rarely dirtied their own fingers. They didn't need to. Beneath them were the stewards, the organizers. These men and women kept ledgers as cold as stone. They calculated how many slaves were needed for a feast, how many would survive the games, how many replacements had to be purchased at the next market. They planned the logistics of cruelty like accountants balancing a ledger. To them, flesh was a resource. Suffering was inventory. Then came the guards, brutal enforcers. Their task was not to think, but to obey. They manned the prisons dug into the foundations of villas, where light never reached. They shackled men to walls, dragged women into chambers, silenced those who screamed too loudly. Their presence ensured order, an order of chains, blood, and silence. And at the bottom of this pyramid were the victims, slaves taken from conquered lands, children born into servitude, villagers seized as tribute. They were the raw material of the system, processed, categorized, used, and discarded. The logistics were chilling in their efficiency. Beneath palaces were chambers designed not for living, but for breaking. Banquet rituals followed a schedule. Humiliation at the beginning, blood sport in the middle, final entertainments toward the end. Even the prisons were arranged with purpose. Cells for the young, cells for the strong, pits for those considered spent, and the bureaucracy left no room for doubt. Surviving records catalog human beings by weight, by height, by fertility. Notes written in margins mark some as fit for breeding, others as useful for spectacle, lives reduced to numbers, bodies treated like livestock. This was not chaos. This was ritual. It was organization at its most merciless. They didn't simply indulge in cruelty. They industrialized it. The system turned torment into routine, suffering into spectacle, death into paperwork. It was a cycle that fed itself. Nobles demanded, stewards planned, guards enforced, victims provided, again and again until the line between feast and massacre disappeared. And yet, as cold as this machine was, what it produced only grew worse with time, because when cruelty becomes routine, the appetite for horror only escalates, and what came next was even darker. The machine of cruelty turned endlessly, and with each cycle, the appetite of the aristocrats grew bolder, darker, more depraved. What began as ritual soon became obsession. What began as indulgence became necessity. At the grand feasts, where golden goblets shimmered and roasted meats perfumed the air, not all entertainment came from music or poetry. Some of it came from suffering. Slaves were forced to crawl across marble floors, chained and naked, carrying platters with trembling arms as nobles jeered. A misstep, a single drop of spilled wine, was met with lashes across their backs. Others were forced into grotesque performances. A child ordered to sing until his voice cracked. A mother forced to dance, her chains rattling in rhythm with the lyres. Nobles clapped, not for talent but for humiliation. Laughter echoed through the halls as tears streamed down faces. These feasts were not mere meals. They were orchestrated degradations, staged to remind every victim that they were less than human. Each course of food was paired with a spectacle of suffering, but this was just the appetizer. Beyond the banquet halls, deeper in the villas, lay chambers few outsiders ever saw. Here, the aristocrats indulged in blood. Victims were pitted against one another, stripped of weapons, forced to claw, bite, and strangle in desperate bids to survive. The nobles cheered, wagering coins and jewels on which broken soul would outlast the other. When the fights ended, the victor was rarely spared. Survival was not rewarded. It was prolonged only for another game. The losers? Their bodies dragged away, discarded like empty vessels. The stones of the chamber still bear the stains. Iron oxide where blood seeped into porous rock. Darker patches where flesh burned under torches. And the laughter. Always the laughter. It filled the vaulted ceilings as if cruelty itself was the music of the elite. They didn't stop when the blood dried. To the aristocrats, even stillness could be twisted into humiliation. Servants were forced to kneel for hours, their backs supporting tables of bronze and trays of food. Others crouched at the feet of nobles, their bodies used as footstools. Women were bent into painful arches to serve as living chairs, while guards stood nearby to whip any who faltered. The cruelty lay not only in the act, but in the deliberate slowness. To remain motionless while limbs trembled, while muscles tore, while circulation failed, was agony disguised as utility, and the nobles delighted in it, lounging on human bodies while whispering poetry, sipping wine, discussing philosophy as if greatness could excuse degradation. For them, People were decor. Flesh turned into furniture. And when bones finally broke, when bodies collapsed, they were replaced with new victims, new ornaments. But some were turned into more than furniture. When indulgence was no longer enough, the aristocrats sought curiosity. They became self-proclaimed physicians of torment. Victims were bound to tables in chambers reeking of blood and herbs. With knives, the nobles cut into skin, not to heal, but to watch. They burned flesh to observe resilience. They poisoned drinks to measure how long death took to arrive. These were not moments of drunken madness. They were recorded as observations. Scrolls detail the color of blood, the way screams changed with each wound, the time it took before collapse. Knowledge was carved from agony. The aristocrats wore the mask of science, but behind it was sadism, a fascination with suffering so methodical, it blurred the line between curiosity and cruelty. And still, the worst was yet to come. Every year, the aristocrats extended their cruelty beyond palace walls. Whole villages were summoned to witness the festival of shame. Streets were decorated with garlands, incense burned, music played. But this was no celebration, it was public humiliation. Villagers were stripped, paraded through the crowd, mocked by nobles perched on high platforms. Some were branded before their neighbors, others whipped until their backs split open. Families were forced to degrade one another, to break bonds of dignity before the cheering elite. And the people watching, the common folk, were trapped. To look away was treason. To cry out was rebellion. So they clapped, forced smiles plastered across their faces, even as tears welled in their eyes. The festival was not only cruelty, it was control, a demonstration that no one, not even the free, could escape the shadow of aristocratic power. What followed would scar generations. The Festival of Shame was no ordinary gathering. It was the crown jewel of aristocratic cruelty, the moment when private depravity spilled onto public streets. From the first light of dawn, the city transformed. Garlands hung across archways, incense curled skyward in blue-gray trails. Drums beat a rhythm that shook the earth. To an outsider, it might have seemed a day of celebration. But for those forced to take part, it was terror dressed in finery. The nobles arrived first. Draped in silk and jewels, their litters carried high above the masses. They descended from palaces like gods visiting mortals. Their laughter filled the avenues even before the spectacle began. Behind them came the victims, villagers, slaves, prisoners, dragged from cells and cottages alike. Chains clinked against cobblestones. Bare feet bled as they stumbled forward, pulled into the heart of the crowd. Step by step, the ritual unfolded. Music swelled, but it could not drown the sound of whimpers. Perfume burned in braziers, but it could not mask the stench of fear. Children clung to their mothers, trembling, as guards drove them forward with whips. At the center square, platforms had been built. Stages not for theater, but for degradation. Villagers were forced to kneel beneath the gaze of the elite. Their heads were shaved, their clothes torn away. Aristocrats pointed, mocked, and raised their cups as if toasting to suffering itself. Then came the games. Families were ordered to slap one another, to curse their own kin, to crawl on all fours while the nobles howled with delight. Those who hesitated were struck, branded, or worse, dragged to the side where executioners waited. The climax came with blood. A boy, no older than 10, was forced to run circles around the platform until he collapsed, gasping, ribs visible through his thin chest. A young woman was made to kneel, her back bared, while nobles debated aloud how many lashes she could endure before fainting. Each strike echoed across the square like a drumbeat of despair. Her cries rose into the sky, swallowed by the roar of aristocratic laughter. And the crowd, the common folk, watched. Some turned their faces away, but guards patrolled with sharp eyes. Anyone who did not clap, anyone who did not cheer, was dragged onto the stage to join the victims. Terror forced hands to rise, forced mouths to shout in false celebration. Fathers clapped while their children wept beside them. Mothers smiled through tears, knowing silence meant death. The Festival of Shame was more than cruelty. It was control, a ritual designed not just to break the bodies of the enslaved, but to poison the souls of the free, to make witnesses complicit, to weave fear into the very fabric of society. As the sun set and the nobles returned to their villas, the streets reeked of smoke and blood. The victims lay broken, discarded like refuse, while the crowd dispersed in silence. No songs followed. No genuine laughter lingered. Only the memory of horror carried home in every trembling step. Because in the Festival of Shame, It wasn't just the victims who were enslaved. It wasn't just the nobles who reveled in cruelty. It wasn't just the guards who enforced the terror. It wasn't just the nobles who were trapped in this horror. It was everyone. But centuries later, when the palaces crumbled and the aristocrats were gone, a different kind of silence began. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of erasure. The conquerors, the chroniclers, the guardians of history, they chose what would remain. Papyrus scrolls that describe the feasts of shame were burned in temple fires, their ashes scattered so no eye could ever read the words again. Frescoes that once showed chained bodies and twisted spectacles were plastered over, brightened with scenes of harvest and worship. Inscriptions carved into stone were re-chiseled, words of cruelty replaced with hymns to glory. And in modern times, when archaeology unearthed bones scarred with cut marks or chambers stained with blood, the discoveries were quickly hidden. Artifacts were locked away in museum basements, filed under labels like ceremonial objects or funerary remains. Scholars translated fragments of papyrus, but published only the sections that fit a narrative of ritual, tradition, entertainment. They softened screams into songs. They renamed humiliation as games. Why? Because to reveal the truth would shatter the illusion of civilization's greatness. It would mean admitting that the very cultures we admire for philosophy, architecture, and art were built on brutality so vile that even modern tongues hesitate to name it. So the record was cleaned, the marble polished, the ugliness buried once more. The horror wasn't hidden by them, it was hidden by us, and yet fragments still slip through. Bones tell their own story. Silent chambers echo even centuries later. The truth resists silence, pushing through the cracks of history like weeds through stone. And the darkest secret, the one even historians dare not face, was yet to be revealed. For buried among the fragments, in whispers passed between scholars behind closed doors, lies evidence too grotesque to fit the polished narrative of civilization. Evidence that does not merely speak of humiliation or of blood, but of hunger, of flesh. Several accounts, torn and incomplete, describe feasts where the final course was not fruit, nor wine, but human. Papyrus fragments speak of the meat of the small, and offerings of youth, consumed in silence. Inscriptions hidden beneath later carvings mention the feast of gods, when children are given. Archaeological remains tell the rest. Bones of the very young, scorched and split in ways consistent not with burial, but with butchery. At first, historians dismissed it as metaphor, as exaggeration meant to shame fallen dynasties. But the forensics refused to yield. Knife marks scored across rib cages too small to belong to grown men, craniums cracked deliberately, marrow scooped out. And in one excavation beneath what was once a banquet hall, a pit filled with charred bones, children and infants mingled with ash and pottery shards used to serve food. This was no myth, it was a ritual. The nobles called it devotion, a sacrifice to gods of plenty. But it was more than sacrifice, it was indulgence. Flesh consumed as proof of power, meat eaten as proof of control. And in the most chilling accounts, victims, parents, siblings, slaves, were forced to partake. Made to taste the flesh of kin while aristocrats laughed, their jeweled fingers dripping with fat, their cups raised in mock toasts. Imagine the horror. A father compelled to eat what remained of his child, a mother's lips pressed to food she knew came from the body of her own blood, and all of it watched by nobles who feasted not out of need, but out of the thrill of desecration. This was the final corruption of power, when human life ceased to be sacred, ceased even to be expendable labor, and became cuisine. When cruelty was not just seen, or heard, or endured, but swallowed. It was not merely the body that was broken, it was the spirit. Victims were forced to carry that taste forever, to live knowing they had been made accomplices in horror. That is the kind of wound no scar can heal, no history can contain, and still, most historians look away. For how can you write of philosophy, of art, of beauty, when beneath it lies the image of aristocrats raising cups of blood? This was not entertainment. This was not ritual. This was the abyss of power, where humanity itself was consumed. And so we must step back, not only to recoil at the horror, but to ask the question that lingers in the silence. Why? Why, when given absolute power, do human beings descend into such depths? The answer lies not only in the cruelty of the few, but in the silence of the many. Victims were stripped of voice, their stories erased, their suffering buried under marble and myth. They could not speak, so history spoke for them. And history chose to glorify their oppressors. The poets sang of beauty, but their songs drowned the screams. The sculptors carved triumphs, but never chains. The chroniclers praised wisdom, but turned away from blood. This is the broader human tragedy. Luxury fed on suffering. Greatness fed on degradation. What the world praised as refinement was, at its core, a banquet built upon broken backs. The aristocrats' palaces rose higher because the victims were forced lower. And when the stones of those palaces remain, gleaming in museums and photographs, the human cost is rarely told. History remembers their palaces. It forgets their screams, and yet if we allow the silence to stand unbroken, we become part of that erasure. Because the greatest cruelty is not only in what they did, but in how easily we choose to look away. What you have heard is not just their story. It is a warning, a reminder of what happens when power loses its anchor in humanity. But worse, a civilization even more ruthless than these aristocrats. An empire that did not just humiliate, but annihilated. Where cruelty was not hidden in palaces, but paraded openly through cities as law. Where the scale of suffering made even the festival of shame look almost merciful. If you think these aristocrats were horrific, wait until you hear what the next empire did. Their cruelty makes this look tame. That story is coming. And when it unfolds, you will understand just how deep the darkness of history truly goes. If this journey unsettled you, if it forced you to question what civilization really means, then stay with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below, because history's darkest truths are the ones we're told not to remember. And yet, they are the ones we most desperately need to hear. The most disgusting practices of ancient aristocrats, a glittering palace filled with gold, music, and laughter. But behind the walls, hidden from history's polished pages, lay the most disgusting and disturbing practices of ancient aristocrats. This documentary-style deep dive exposes the shocking truths the history books refuse to tell you. Banquets of humiliation, blood sports, human furniture, twisted experiments of pain, and cannibal rituals disguised as sacred feasts. Archaeological evidence, suppressed records, and chilling accounts reveal how luxury was built on suffering, humiliation, and blood. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were systematic, ritualized, and industrialized horrors carried out by those worshipped as refined and godlike. What you're about to hear is not entertainment. It is history's darkest warning. If you think this was horrific, wait until you see what the next empire did. Their cruelty makes this look tame. Subscribe for more forbidden history, shocking truths, and Netflix-style deep dives into humanity's darkest past.